Welcome to Passionate About Our Holidays. This is the first installment of what might be more to come of what we call a vlog, a video blog, a video presentation on a salient issue. Recently, it was brought to my attention the question about Christians holding Seders. And in the midst of Passover and with Easter coming up in just a few days, I decided to reach out to two friends of mine, Rabbi Steve Gross of HCRJ and Senior Pastor Stephen Bezner of Houston Northwest Church. Stephen is an evangelical pastor, and of course you all know Steve Gross, Reform Rabbi, and myself. And we got into a really interesting conversation, and I think you will get a lot out of it. A lot of learning and a lot of discoveries of potential sensitivities, potential opportunities for outreach and bridge building. So without further ado, I welcome you to Passionate About Our Holidays.
Thank you all for joining this Zoom conversation. It is great to connect with colleagues and especially friends with whom I've built a relationship and across our city and across denominations. So as I mentioned to you guys, I got two different congregants within 10 minutes of each other sending me a text with an article, which I imagine has happened to both of you at times before, where they're very, very concerned and very, flummoxed about a particular issue. And this article was basically, in short, it was an article about a Christian woman in some part of the country, I don't even know where, who posted on Facebook about her family's Christian Seder. So this Seder is the Passover observance, and this is a Christian Seder, and she showed that she baked a challah that was in the shape of a cross, and they had poppy seed cake for dessert, and then they talked about and read about the concept of Jesus as the Paschal offering, as God's offering, and my Jewish congregants were very just distressed about this characterization of Passover, and not the least of which had to do with the fact that we're not supposed to eat bread of any kind on Passover. So to have a cross-shaped challah sort of, I think, stuck in their craw. But the article was on Yahoo News because there was such a vehement negative response from comments against this woman that, frankly, I read and I thought, oh gosh, I felt bad for her. In my sense, as a rabbi, as a human being, I don't think she was intending anything negative. I don't think she was intending anything bad, but obviously it really touched a nerve. And I think most of the comments were from Jewish people. So I wanted to start there, just as a conversation about that, in general, like that topic of Seders within the Jewish community, Seders within the Christian community, and how those play out in your experience, in your life, in your church, in your synagogue. And one of you can start.
Yeah, I'll start. One of the most important things from the Jewish community that we need to recognize and celebrate is that the Christian community wants to embrace the love and celebration and the experience of the Seder itself. Because if we look back in history, this was probably every year, when I say this, the springtime was one of the most anti-Semitic, violent periods every year against the Jewish people. Pogroms and uprisings against Jews because of blood libels and things that would take place in the springtime were horrible. So this is a time to celebrate and embrace and enjoy the fact that Christian brothers and sisters in the world can come together and learn and share in the beauty of the Passover. Now, I'll let Pastor Steve kind of comment in a second, but I will say that as this happens and as we embrace these things, there are various levels of understanding. What was the Last Supper? The theological ideas that are woven into a Christian celebration is varied and rich and beautiful. But there's lots, just like the Christmas story, there are lots of different tellings of that same thing. I'll make one last comment. While we know that matzah is the matzah that we eat today, the dry, unleavened bread, when we look at the Last Supper as it's articulated, as it's translated into the Greek, and Steve, you're going to be able to correct me in my pronunciations, but the bread that is talked about through, I believe it's Paul's articulation of the Seders story, talks about, he uses the Greek word for bread that is leavened, not unleavened. I believe the word for bread that was used by Paul is artos, rather than azima. I think azima is unleavened and artos is the leavened bread, and Paul uses artos. So she's not too far off if she's trying to kind of go along with the Corinthians level. I'm sure he didn't shape it into a cross, though.
Right. Yeah, thanks, rabbis. I really appreciate you inviting me onto this. You know, as evangelical Christians, it feels like just about every week we come up with a new way to offend other people. So I appreciate you at least giving me an opportunity to talk about it. I think that what Rabbi Steve has said is true. I think that most likely this woman came with a very pure motive. There's a strain of Christian theology that became pretty popular around 1900 in the United States, which actually I think we could credit with the changing of attitudes towards the Jewish people in the Christian circle. It's a strain of theology that is still fairly popular, but really around 1900, I'm not certain about the European aspect, but for sure in the United States, as this theology gained ground, individuals began to seek to embrace the Jewish grounding of Christianity much more openly. And so by the time you get to, say, 1950, I think there was a public perception within evangelicalism that not only was Jesus's Jewishness to be celebrated and embraced, but also the Jewish people in general. And obviously, those who you men both know, and those of us who've been to Israel before know that that's why there's now a very vibrant tourist industry, you know, among evangelical Christians who want to go, to use their words, to the Holy Land. So I think that that's sort of been this interesting, relationship. So I would guess, I don't know this, that this woman is probably, kind of some sort of tie to this sort of theology, and that she's felt like, oh, I want to just continue to honor Jesus's Jewish heritage. At the same time, I think that there's definitely some sense of co-opting at the very least. I can understand if I was Jewish why I might find that offensive. I mean, particularly the idea of the bread formed into the shape of a cross for a number of reasons there. A, it's yeast, and B, it's a cross. But I think that probably the woman's heart was in no way to be anti-Semitic, but I would almost imagine that in her mind it was to be in some way respectful of Jesus's Jewish heritage. So it's sort of an interesting thing, not to keep talking here, but just one more brief comment. Although various things have precluded it from happening, at some point, we have invited Rabbi Steve to come and lead a Seder for us, but to do it from a perspective that's, the Jewish perspective, and then for us to talk about, are there things that we read in our scriptures, the New Testament, that we see that point back to that? And one of the reasons that we wanted to do that was actually to make this very distinction. Rabbi Steve mentioned the letter to the Corinthians that Paul writes, and most historians of the early church believe that Christians, from the very beginning, as they were meeting in homes, were taking this meal, this commemorative meal of the body and the blood, so to speak, every single time that they gathered. So therefore, definitely matzah would not have been the most common element. They would have been taking whatever daily, bread they would have made into cakes or that sort of thing that day, broken it together, blessed it, and drunk whatever wine they would have had on hand. And they did that to commemorate and remember their understanding of Jesus as Messiah. So I think that there's probably a lot of misinformation with that particular woman, and probably within even her own theological tribe, I would guess. But I doubt that there are ill intentions. Not to say that there aren't plenty of other groups that have plenty of ill intentions, but that would be my suspicion.
So one of these congregants that had reached out to me shared with me in this text exchange that she was talking about this issue with some other people. And one person responded to her. They said, well, I know lots of Jews who have Christmas trees in their homes, and their parents and grandparents, they had Christmas trees in their homes. Isn't that the same thing? And, it really was an interesting question to pose, because I think one of the questions, and I know this gets into sort of like high level philosophy to a certain extent, but it becomes this question of, the signifier and the signified, right? Does the symbol necessarily have to mean for one person what it has necessarily always meant for another? And it's a very, very fine line. I mean, it's very, very difficult. It's very blurry to know when you've crossed the line, whether it's religious syncretism or misappropriation, right? But I wonder where you guys fall on that spectrum. Are there things that you feel as a religious leader where you say, you know what, this is a line that we shouldn't cross, even if it might be creative or interesting or, exciting to people?
Yeah, Rabbi Steve, if you don't mind, since this is the Christian particular, this example, I'll go first and then I'll throw it to you. I think on the example with the Christmas tree, what's interesting is I would say that, most Christians pretty much assume that people of other faiths backgrounds might have a Christmas tree, because in general, that particular aspect of Christmas is definitely not as linked with the Jesus story. It's linked with the legend of St. Nicholas and his generosity. And I'm sure that you men are familiar with that. But I think that, and then there's all sorts of other, I'm sure you probably are familiar with this too, but there's lots of folks who think that the Christmas tree has pagan roots and this sort of thing. So I think that, Christians don't really mind that at all. I think that in the same way as with the Jewish celebration of Passover in the Jewish community, I think that there might be certain things I don't know that Christians would necessarily be offended by, but they would want to understand the motive behind if for some reason the birth of Jesus, I suppose, was somehow celebrated or brought in. And I think back to your point, Scott, that's the signified, not the signifier. It's not the symbol itself. So, I mean, I don't know that I would care if I saw someone of a different faith background wearing a cross necklace. I don't know that I would mind if I saw them even, celebrating or joining us in celebrating certain holidays. I think it's just about the handling of the person of Jesus. A few years ago, we invited some of the members of the mosque here in our neighborhood to our Easter services. This was in 2019, pre-pandemic. And I think we had about 30 folks from the mosque come. And so we have 3 worship services on that day. So we invited them to the 9:30 service. They came. At 11 a.m., I was preaching, so I couldn't go. I was leading that next service. But several of the members of our congregation hosted a brunch where they did a Q&A for our friends from the mosque so that they could ask questions. And we just loved it because one of their very first questions was, hey, where's the bunny? We didn't see anything about the rabbit today. And we were like, oh yeah, that's got nothing to do with what we do here. But they didn't know that. And so I think that, when it comes to so many of these symbols, that's almost an extreme example, but it's this sense of which of these symbols are religious, which of these symbols are not religious? Where is it something that we are, co-opting? And so I don't know. It's a tricky question, particularly living in a world that's more and more pluralistic. So I don't know, Steve, what are your thoughts?
Well, my first thought is that this stealing of people's celebrations predates the Bible. I mean, we look at archaeological evidence, and even ancient Israelite practices often were rooted before kind of how the Israelites become a monotheistic, and then ultimately the faith that we practice today. So this is not something, first of all, that happens overnight, right? It evolves over hundreds of years, and secondly, it's nothing new. The idea of symbol is a powerful one, right? So a symbol has to communicate a message when seen or experienced, and that is really where I like to focus when I gather, and when I get the blessing of gathering with your church, Steve, next year at Houston Northwest Church, we'll explore this, and that is what is being communicated. What is the Seder for those practicing it within the Christian community? And I will be brief here because it gets into really deep theology, and you would be able to address it much better than I. But if what is being communicated through the Seder is the attempt to replicate the Last Supper, or that Seder meal, then it's important to recognize that what Jesus practiced as a Jew in the time of the temple looked probably almost completely different than what the Jews practice today, because our Seders today are rabbinic creations which are created a couple hundred years after.
Right.
So that's an interesting piece. And yet, if you are trying to articulate through the rituals being practiced during that Christian Seder the teachings of John, it would be a very, very different, because for John, as I understand Christian teachings, for John, Jesus as Christ must be the Paschal offering, right? And so the Seder doesn't even take place the same night as it would in the Jewish. So the theology that's woven into the fabric of what we practice is an important one to develop as a Christian community and as a Jewish community in relationship with the Christian community. So I think we're really at a nascent place as Christians try to remember the beauty of the life of Jesus and the significant turning point for Jesus as Christ. They want to mark that meal. I think it's a beautiful effort, and I don't think we as Jews should be offended, but perhaps we should take it as an opportunity to explore theology with each other.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sorry, Scott, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say a couple of quick things in response to that. Number one, that's what I know we're looking forward to, is to have a rabbi come to lead us through a Seder meal. I've shared with both Scott and Steve that there are Christian ministries that do this, but they have a certain bent. And I think that it's better if we have a rabbi come lead the Seder, and then we have an opportunity to then go, oh, okay, well, now that's a connection between some of the language and the wording that we see in the New Testament. And then, the second thing I think that you just said, Steve, which is really important for those who are watching this, if you've never read any of the Gospels, there are 4 Gospels that are biographical accounts of the life of Jesus, and they are named after the individuals who wrote them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called sometimes the synoptic Gospels because they look the same. they're essentially biographical accounts. But as Rabbi Steve just mentioned, John, the fourth gospel, as it's sometimes called, is very different. And that's because most people believe that John was seeking less to write a historical biography and instead was seeking to write a theological telling of who they understood Jesus to be. And so that's why I think that John writes the way that he writes. He's attempting to make a theological connection between the life of Jesus and between the Jewish story of Passover. And so for John, it's less about getting the dates exactly right. It's more about, let me make certain that my audience understands the message that I'm trying to communicate. So, yeah, I think that in both of those scenarios, it's instructive, and I would really love the idea of learning from your communities on this particular aspect.
Well, so this has been a great conversation, and I want to add one other piece to it, because we've been talking a lot about communal connection, communal partnership, and cooperation. We're definitely bringing up issues of theology, but I want to bring us back to what Steve referred to at the beginning, which is history, right? Because the history piece, I think, is so important, because as a rabbi, I wasn't offended when I read this article about what this woman did exactly, but I was shocked by the cross-shaped challah. And the reason why is because I know lots of Jews. There's a law in Orthodox Jewish tradition that a Jew is not allowed, right? They're forbidden from entering a church or any other sacred space of any other religious tradition. And that, plays itself out in different communities in different ways. But there are plenty of non-Orthodox Jews for whom, and I'm not saying that this is right, but when they are at the supermarket and someone is wearing a cross, they're bothered, maybe even offended. It's not at all the fault of the person wearing the cross. It is all about their own, what's going on in their own heart, in their own mind, memory. And yet, to take one of the central observances of Passover, the bread, or the matzah, the unleavened bread, and use bread in the shape of a cross, right? That's the piece that I think really grabbed me, that, if it wasn't defensive, it sure wasn't very knowledgeable.
It wasn't thoughtful, that's for sure.
It wasn't thoughtful, exactly. And I bring this up especially this year, in light of what's been going on in the last year at least, is that, QAnon peddles in conspiracy theories, the central one of which is that, Democrats take children and use their blood. And where does that come from? Or drink their blood. And where does that come from? It comes from the blood libel from the 11th century, which was that the Jews kidnapped Christian children and used their blood to make matzah. Whenever I say that out loud, I almost think like, God, that's got to be, can't really be that. And yet, that is exactly what was taught. They would even go so far, I was telling you, Steve, about how the medieval torture comb, and they would say that the Jews would use that, and that's how you get the little ridges on the matzah. And they would even say to people in their churches that if you listen closely, you can hear the screams of Christian children. Now, I don't mean to be profane and awful as I describe this, but I'm not making this up, right? This is in the text. This is in what was used against the Jews. But especially when you see it recreated in the guise of QAnon, we need to know our history, right? People need to know that this terrible accusation isn't new, right? It's been carried through the church. It's been carried through the Muslim world as in anti-Semitism. It's been carried through the protocols for the elders of Zion. It was carried through Hitler, right? This stuff has been recreated, whether it's been put against Jews or, as you can see, others. So I wanted to put that out there as our last topic for conversation and just ask, what responsibility do we as clergy have to make sure that our congregations know and understand the history within the Christian context and within the Jewish context, so that we can, work against this stuff being repeated? I thought I'd end with an easy question.
Yeah, I think that sadly, I made a lighthearted joke at the beginning that, evangelicals find a new way to offend people every week. But I think that, the Christian community post-Constantine has been in a majority position in much of Western civilization. And because of that, I think that the faith that really, I think, was authentic in its expression in the first 3 centuries, really, I think, took a turn post-Constantine, and depending on the context where you find yourself, continues to still struggle with that. And I think that not simply QAnon, I just think in general, whenever Christianity has been in a majority context, and you know what, it might not just be Christianity, it might just be any position in a majority context. I think then that, whenever faith and power begin to mix, then the truer aspects of the faith begin to be lost. And so I think that's a thing that I know that we try to talk about regularly, in the sense that care for the marginalized is a deep concern of the Hebrew scriptures. It's a deep concern of the Christian scriptures, and that's got to be our primary voice. So we try to really lean in on that. And to be frank and fair, I don't know that I do a fair job or a good job even of educating on how Christians historically have been anti-Semitic. I think I focus more on racial relations because that's a much more contemporary topic in our city and in our nation. But I know we have talked about just historically, whenever power has been at play, we have betrayed who it was we were supposed to be. Those are probably my first thoughts, but I'll listen to Rabbi Steve and go from there.
So there's so much to unpack with everything that you brought, Scott. I'll just first kind of go back to the symbol in this woman who, probably with good intention to celebrate a Seder, with not a lot of knowledge. The cross for her is a symbol. The cross for her is Jesus. The cross for her, in the shape of the bread, it not being unleavened, was not probably anything that she was bringing all of this historical baggage to, right? So from the external side of a Jewish reader of this story, we bring our baggage and our history to that. So the way that at least all of us on this Zoom screen have approached this is relationships with each other help to recontextualize all of that stuff. And so that's really where we all need to focus every day, and every day in the present will change the future. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. And this season, for Christians and Jews in particular, other faiths as well, but for Christians and Jews in particular, because it involves the Paschal offering that for John is Jesus, and involves the Last Supper, we have an opportunity to share and learn from each other and focus on what's most important. And the three things that I would articulate that we share so much at this season is the concept of deliverance from bondage, deliverance from the narrow places, deliverance from being in a bad place to a good place, right? For the Jewish people, it's through the Exodus. For Christianity, it is through Jesus. The second theme, which is so critical for us to focus on, and to not to debate to prove the other wrong, but rather to understand each other's ideas of a messianic day. I mean, that's so central to the Seder, and it's absolutely that's what Easter is all about. And then finally, the theme that Steve, you were kind of sharing is that these messages of a messianic day to come, and this message of a deliverance, is a contemporary issue in every generation. And the punchline, or one of the punchlines of the Passover Seder, is until all are free, none are free. So regardless of the fact if we have different understandings of the ultimate redemption and the Messiah, we can join hands and pave a way for that day by kind of building bridges of understanding and fighting for freedom for all in our day. So that's what this season invites, rather than pogroms and blood libels and right. So by sharing, so it's a little bit different. They have a cross-shaped challah and we have dry matzah. Yeah, okay, those are just symbols, but let us work. Let us translate the meaning of these holidays into action in the world.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, Steve. I was very surprised whenever I was a seminarian and I first discovered that there were people who had historically used the crucifixion of Jesus to slander Jews. I had never heard that in the congregation where I grew up, and thankfully I've never heard it preached in a single church or part of any community, ever. I don't doubt that it's still out there in some circles, but I think that what you just said, Steve, is important, because I think for some who see an individual wearing a cross or carrying a cross, it's a reminder of an offense. And I think that that's why it's important for us in the Christian community to remind that the cross is a symbol of deliverance and a symbol of hope, a symbol of sacrificial love, not a symbol that's used to denigrate any other people. And so what you just said, Steve, the idea of making certain that our people carry the right meaning with their symbols is huge. So as we approach Easter, we're going to talk about the Good Friday, Easter Sunday paradox, which is self-sacrificing love on Good Friday. And then if we live in self-sacrificing love, we experience the beauty and the power of the resurrection. So Jesus gave his self-sacrifice and then experienced the resurrection. And if we place our faith in him, we too can live out of self-sacrificial love and have the hope of a resurrection. And to me, if we can, just educate our congregations around those symbols, then we can really bring home the truth and really, really encourage people to live out of that.
Well, just to bring this to a little conclusion, I wanted to just bring to mind that, ironically, it is a better time for sure that Christians are wanting to adopt and adapt Jewish rituals instead of denigrating, right, and opposing and persecuting, right? I mean, one could make the argument. I mean, historically, it's not accurate, but one could make the argument, ahistorically, that Christians seeing Jesus Last Supper as a Jewish ritual, is actually affirming to the Jewish conception that Jesus was a Jew, And therefore, Christian anti-Semitism is really an oxymoron, right? So one could make that argument, but nonetheless, I would rather live in the world where we're debating with words what these symbols mean and who should be using them and how, etc., than the world that existed not long before 100 years ago, and often more recently and less, but still, it's still a better world today for us to be able to have these conversations and as friends and grow in our friendship and grow in our connection with each other, which really brings to heart and mind that these symbols and rituals and themes are so in common. The signifiers may be different. The signified of redemption and salvation and deliverance and possibility, I think that's the business we're in. So I thank you guys so much. I wish Steve and my communities a happy Passover for the remainder of the week. And to you, Pastor Steve Bezner, to your community of Houston Northwest Church, may you guys have a wonderful and blessed Easter.
Thank you very much. Thanks for letting me be with you today.
Thank you, guys. Thanks so much.
It's beautiful to be together.